Hello, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Total Ramblings. I have literally just finished watching episode 1 of series 2 of Andor. And I'm going to tell you now that I'm going to be going through a very detailed plot summary, and there's going to be spoilers, massive spoilers. So if you haven't seen this episode, or you don't want to be spoiled, or even both of those things, then maybe watch this after you've gone and watched it. It was released today on Disney Plus, and in fact, 3 episodes of series 2 have been released, and my understanding is that they're going to be releasing 3 episodes a week. I further understand that every batch of 3 episodes is a year in the life of Andor, or there's going to be a year's gap between each batch. And indeed, this particular episode is called 1 year later, because it's following on from the events that we saw at the end of series 1 on the planet Ferrix. Now, if you don't know, Andor is set before the Battle of Yavin, before the first Star Wars film, which people call A New Hope. I call it Star Wars because that's what it was called when I went to see it in 1977 at the cinema. It's called Star Wars, right? Anyway, and for anyone who doesn't know, there was a prequel called Rogue One, which basically covered off the events that we saw in the opening crawl of Star Wars, which basically depicted the rebellion's first kind of battle against the Empire, which they won, and the acquisition of the plans to the Death Star, which of course in Star Wars we saw ultimately, spoilers, being blown up by Luke Skywalker. Now at the end of Rogue One, one of our people that we've been following, Cassian Andor, a rebel agent, was killed. In fact, just about everybody died at the end of Rogue One. So this is a prequel to the prequel. In series 1 of Andor, we saw how Cassian went basically from being a kind of, outsider kind of hustler to basically being recruited into the rebellion. And now we are a year later, and Cassian is working with a guy called Luthen, who is quite high up in the rebellion. I don't know if it's the Rebel Alliance yet. I don't think so. I think it's just different rebel cells. The Rebel Alliance kind of happens during the series Rebels, when the rebels ally, basically. Anyway, so basically Cassian is working under Luthen, and in this opening episode we are thrown straight into the action. We have an opening credit which says BBY 4. This is 4 years before the Battle of Yavin. So 4 years before Rogue One, because Rogue One led straight into Star Wars, and that concluded with the Battle of Yavin, where the Death Star was destroyed. And we open up, and we're on the planet Shinar, as it happens. Now, Shinar is a name well known by Star Wars fans, because it's the home of a company or family company called Shinar Fleet Systems. Shinar Fleet Systems are well known for their manufacture and production and design of TIE fighters of various types as used by the Empire. And we open to see a brand new TIE Avenger sitting on its wings in a hangar bay. Now, again, if you don't know, the TIE Avenger originally appeared in the Star Wars TIE Fighter game from the early 1990s. Now, I played the heck out of Star Wars TIE Fighter. It's probably my favourite game of all time. You basically play as a TIE Fighter pilot working for the Empire, and you go through a series of campaigns suppressing various rebel insurgencies and local diplomatic stuff, blah, 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 blah. And ultimately, you start getting sort of to fly TIE fighter prototypes. Now, One of those prototypes is the TIE Defender, and we've seen the TIE Defender. So this is all what is known as Star Wars Expanded Universe. And prior to when Disney took over Star Wars, the Star Wars EU was effectively the canon, if you like. They had multiple levels of canon within Star Wars at the time. Ultimately, of course, the films took precedence. Then I think it was books, comics following that, and they were canon, kind of, unless a subsequent film came out which contradicted them. And the Star Wars Expanded Universe, it was fantastic. This bookshelf here in the corner, right behind me, is rack to rack, toe to tail, full of Star Wars Expanded Universe in historical chronological order, with the actual Star Wars film appearing roughly in the middle. So we've got Jedi stuff, and then we've kind of got post sort of Return of the Jedi kind of stuff. The Star Wars TIE Fighter game was part of that expanded universe. What's happened is, overnight, when Disney took over Star Wars, when they bought it, they declared all of the EU stuff as non-canon and started with their own sort of canon. And slowly but surely, they've introduced old characters and concepts and spaceships back into Disney canon, if you like. So a good example of that is Grand Admiral Thrawn, who was a big character in the Star Wars EU, who was rendered non-canon and then basically was brought back in to the Star Wars canon, albeit with a slightly different storyline. And we started to see things like previous TIE fighters from the TIE Fighter game appearing in the new Disney canon. So coming back to the TIE Avenger, that featured in the Rebels series, albeit the history of its design and development and manufacture was different from the original EU. In the new Disney canon, we now have another ship called the TIE Defender, and essentially they're kind of bringing these things back in. Now, in the TIE Fighter game, I realise I'm rambling on a bit here, but in the TIE Fighter game, before the TIE Defender is introduced into the game, we had the TIE Avenger. Now, this was basically a prototype TIE fighter manufactured in very limited numbers and was essentially the Empire's answer to the Rebel X-Wing fighter. Now, the Rebels had a distinct advantage over the Empire in that where the Empire dominated was in numbers and swarm tactics. A Star Destroyer could carry, a wing of 72 TIE fighters. But the Empire were very paranoid that, pilots might become independent and defect. And so basically those ships were wholly reliant upon their mothership, their carrier, to ferry them around. Whereas the Rebels could effectively mount hit and fade attacks around the galaxy because their fighters had hyperdrives. TIE fighters do not have hyperdrives, as a matter of course. Now, in the TIE Fighter game, the TIE Avenger was introduced, and it was heavily, heavily armed. It had shields and it had a hyperdrive. It was essentially the Empire's version of an X-Wing fighter. So much like in World War II, the Nazis encountered the Russian T-34, they kind of made their own version, which was the Panther tank, and that had many of the features of the T-34, sloped armour, etc., etc. So anyway, getting back to the topic, we see a TIE Avenger in its hangar, and I have to say, this is probably our one and only opportunity for Lego to make an official TIE Avenger Lego set. And if they don't, I'm going to be very upset, because we've had a Lego TIE Defender, we've had Lego TIE Advanced, both types, the X1 and the other type. We've had Lego TIE Interceptors, TIE Bombers, TIE Fighters, TIE Ds. We've had all sorts of different TIE Fighters. And this is the first time in that we've seen the TIE Avenger in anything other than the TIE Fighter game, I believe. Definitely the first time in live action. I don't think it's even been in animation before. This Lego set needs to happen, all right? Because otherwise my Lego fleet will not be complete. Anyway, it's interesting. The first thing I looked for you see the TIE Avenger sitting there, clearly a prototype ship because it doesn't have all of its solar radiation paneling on it, but sitting there, and we later find out it's due for a test flight the next day. But it's interesting. The very first thing I looked for was the window. Now, I don't know if I've got one here that I can show you, but there's essentially an error / ongoing running gag in Star Wars. In Star Wars, the first Star Wars film, the TIE fighter windows are kind of almost octagonal, round octagonal, with a central pane and 8 kind of smaller panes radiating out around. And there's an error in Star Wars whereby when you look at the TIE fighter from outside, and don't quote me as to which way around this is, right? But when you look at the TIE fighter from outside versus inside, the windows are not in the same position. So there's a particular angle where you'll get a window spoke, if you like, right in the pilot's eye vision. And there's another angle where you'll see, in fact, the spokes are either side of where the pilot would be looking. And depending on whether the shot is looking from outside the TIE fighter or from inside the TIE fighter, the windows change position. And in later Star Wars films and productions, they've kind of kept that gag going. It was a mistake. Now they kind of roll into it. And the first thing I looked for was, have they done that with the TIE Avenger? No, they haven't. They've kept the windows the same. Probably to avoid people going, oh, you've got the windows the wrong way around, but never mind. Anyway, we see this TIE Avenger sitting in its hangar. Proof that we've always known, fans have always known, TIE fighters can land on their wingtips. This is sitting on its wingtip. It's not suspended from a gantry like TIE fighters are normally. And we are on the planet Sinar. We are at Test Facility 73. Which I have to say, the shape of its hangars, the kind of triangular shape with an open kind of bay at the front, if you put 3 of those together, that would look just like a space station from the TIE Fighter game. And the way this base is set out with all these different hangars, I immediately thought, that looks like a space station from the TIE Fighter game. Anyway, maybe I'm reading a bit too much into it, but that's what it looked like to me. We meet Cassian Andor, who's dressed as a TIE pilot. And basically he is there to steal the ship. And he meets up with a lady called Nia, who gives him the password. And basically, you know, she's very nervous about what she's about to do. She's about to betray the Empire. And Cassian Andor kind of says, well, these are the moments that he lives for. The moment that Nia is stepping into the circle of the rebellion and basically, you know, revealing her true self and becoming her true self. I thought that was quite a nice bit. Anyway, Andor goes to the TIE Avenger, having shot a droid on the way, and he can't fly the thing because this thing's brand new. And as it turns out, we later find out the controls are not normal. They're not in the same position as a normal TIE fighter. This is a brand new ship, right? And he's having trouble taking off. He manages to find the guns. And I have to say, this thing is heavily armed. It has some kind of torpedo launcher underneath. It seems to have concussion missile racks on the insides of its wings, which is something we didn't see in the original TIE fighter game. It's got sort of Gatling lasers that come out. It seems to have turrets mounted on it. This thing is heavily armed, right? Anyway, he can't fly this thing. Alarms go off, stormtroopers come in, and essentially Cassian shoots his way out and very raggedly escapes from the base, scuffing up the brand new paintwork of this TIE Avenger on the way. Takes out a couple of incoming TIE Advanceds, not the X-1s. These are the TIE Advanceds as flown by the Inquisitor in Rebels. So nice to see those in live action as well. I think it's the first time we've seen those in live action. And essentially manages to escape. We then cut to the Ferrex survivors, and Bix, who's one of Andor's friends, escapees from the riot on Ferrex that we saw at the end of Series 1. She's having a dream. We meet Bimo again, which is the droid. sort of Cassian's droid. And from now on, the story is kind of split into several different little chunks. Essentially, the Ferrex survivors are, they're trying to make do on their planet where they're living, where they are kind of kept surprised. Where they are kind of surprised when a Gozanti class cruiser appears, which is a type of ship operated by the Empire. And it turns out the Empire are doing a census. They have escaped to the planet Mini Rao, which is on the Outer Rim, which is historically an area that the Empire hasn't shown much interest in. But they're doing a census, basically. I guess it's kind of like the Doomsday Book. So here in England, when William the Conqueror conquered England in 1066, he immediately set about an audit of his new territory and sent out people all around the country to identify people and property and assets, and it was called the Doomsday Book. So I kind of get the impression that this is what the Emperor's doing now. He's trying to get a handle on what assets are actually there that he now effectively controls in the Empire. Well, he has controlled them now for 16 years at least, I think. Anyway, so we kind of occasionally we pop back and we meet the sort of Ferrex survivors, but that particular storyline isn't developed very well in this first episode. I imagine in the next two it will be, but of course they are majorly concerned that the Empire have turned up on their door, and of course they're waiting for Andor to come back to them because he's obviously on a mission for the rebellion. The other people that we meet, we are reintroduced to Senator Mon Mothma on her planet of Chandrila, and her daughter Leda is marrying the son of Skulden. And if you recall, and if you don't recall, I'll explain. Basically, Mon Mothma was kind of nearly caught in Series 1, funneling funds through to the rebellion. And essentially, in order to cover this up, she had to involve a businessman associate of hers named Skulden. And his price was that she introduce her daughter to his son and that they get married. So this is essentially Mon Mothma has kind of sacrificed her daughter, if you like, for the sake of the rebellion, because if there'd been an investigation, she would have been found out as a senator that she was supporting the rebellion. The funds might have been traced and it would have been very bad, etc. So this is kind of one of the storylines that we're following. Luthen turns up on Chandrila and is kind of desperate to hear from Cassian. And, that's one of the ongoing storylines. The other ongoing storyline is that Andor lands on a planet. I'm just trying to see if I wrote down the name of the planet. I can't remember whether I did or not. Basically, he's going to meet his contact to deliver the TIE Avenger so that pilot can then take it on, presumably for delivery ultimately to the rebellion, right? Unfortunately, a gang of pirates, or the Maya Pei Brigade as they're called, have unfortunately got involved. They appear to have killed his partner. They, of course, think he's an Imperial test pilot because he's dressed as one and he's in a TIE fighter. They want to kill him, but they haven't eaten for 2 days and they obviously want to get off the planet. There are also some hungry beasts that roam the planet at night. So that's kind of another ongoing storyline. Back on Chandrila, Mon Mothma meets with Tay, who is desperate to kind of discuss, the Foundation with her. I think, he wants to talk rebellion stuff. But essentially, her daughter's had her first falling out with her prospective husband and has run away. And Mon Mothma kind of goes to comfort her. And she's kind of saying, I'm so sorry. But she's not saying sorry about the fact that her daughter and her prospective husband have had an argument. The underlying message, of course, is that Mon Mothma is sorry that, she knows the sacrifice she's had to make by basically introducing her daughter to this unscrupulous businessman's son in order to cover up the rebellion, which is obviously a much greater thing. But essentially, obviously, she feels a lot of regret. She's giving up a lot to maintain this rebellion, if you like. But I think the perhaps the most important thing for me in this episode is the other kind of aspect, which is where we go to a place called the Malthine Divide, and we meet Director Krennic, and we meet Dedra Meero, who is an Imperial intelligence agent from the Imperial Security Bureau, and her boss, and a whole load of other relatively low-ranking Imperials, and they are having a very, 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 very secret conference on this planet. So secret that even the likes of Governor Tarkin, they don't know about it. The Emperor knows. The Emperor says, the Emperor's implied that he will tell people as he chooses. But this conference is super secret. There is no record that anyone was there, and anyone who isn't there is not approved or authorized to know about this project. Now, my immediate thought, of course, was, they're talking about the Death Star. No, they're talking about something which has a much, which is much more interesting in that, again, we are kind of going back to Star Wars expanded universe kind of stuff. And we are talking about the planet Gorman. Now, the planet Gorman in Star Wars EU terms was a pivotal moment in the foundation of the rebellion, various rebel cells, the Rebel Alliance, if you like, because there was a massacre there, the Gorman massacre. Now, I believe there were a couple of different versions of this in the Star Wars EU, one of which was that Governor Tarkin, in an effort to, perhaps not deliberately, but in an effort to quell rioters, had his starship landed on top of them and killed loads of them. But the Gorman massacre is a defining moment in the history of the Rebel Alliance. And it's interesting that, again, this is another aspect that Disney are bringing back into Disney canon from the EU, because there's a lot of good stuff in the EU. And it's interesting that these things are coming back in dribs and drabs. So that's the kind of the second thing with the TIE Avenger. Now we're talking about Gorman that have come back in this one episode. And basically, it turns out that the audience are kind of shown a slightly cheesy video of how Gorman Twill is manufactured using local spiders that live on the planet, 40 billion of them or something. But basically, Director Krennic says Gorman is of great interest to the Empire. And he proceeds to tell them, to remind them, if you like, about the Emperor's energy initiative and energy independence, and says if we can achieve energy independence, this will cement imperial power, it'll be a big tick in our box, etc., etc. I have to wonder, I think we're still talking Death Star here. I think we're still talking, because essentially he goes on to say, it's explained that the planet Gorman contains reserves of a mineral known as calcite. Now, in order to extract this mineral, we are talking about something called, what did they say? Gouge mining, I think it was. Basically, they have to dig out the centre of the planet to get this stuff out. And there are 9 cities and 800,000 people on Gorman. And, there's going to be resistance to this. There have been various steps to try and get alternatives to calcite or, substitutes for it. But basically, they're going to need this calcite. And there's reference to say that it's used to coat reactor lenses. And Director Krennic suggests that this is for this energy initiative project. But I have to wonder, I have to think we're talking about Death Star components here, because the Death Star has a reactor that can generate enough power to blow away a planet. And so it must have an immense reactor system. And this is probably why they need all this calcite. But basically, the whole purpose of the meeting is that they need to think about pacifying the planet. And the way this meeting was set up, with Director Krennic saying, you're not here, there's no record of this meeting. Later on, we kind of see canapes being served and sort of low-ranking Imperial executives talking amongst each other. This was this is the film Conspiracy. If you don't know the film Conspiracy, it covers the Wannsee Conference in World War II, which was a top secret Nazi conference to discuss certain peoples being wiped out. There was officially no record that the people were there. Although minutes were kept, most copies were destroyed until one was found post the war. Basically, it was a load of Nazi functionaries talking about how they were going to wipe out millions of people in a very matter-of-fact way. And the way this was shot and the way this was set and everything about these scenes reminded me of the film Conspiracy, where you've basically got, as I say, these imperial functionaries talking very matter-of-factly about dominating and destroying and butchering, pacifying a planet in order to get the resources that the Empire needs, because essentially there's a danger of planetary collapse. They're going to go in, get this stuff out. They don't really care what happens to the planet. So basically they're talking about how to pacify the planet, and that's why Dedra Meero and her boss are there. And they're there to basically provide options. It turns out that we've got something called the Ministry of Enlightenment, which I don't believe we've heard of before in Star Wars, a couple of civilians, and they've already been setting the scene. They basically say, you've probably heard of the planet Gorman, and you probably have an opinion about its people. That opinion will largely have been driven by us, because they've been sowing the seeds. They've been planting fake news, propaganda about the Gore, who are the people of Gorman, and essentially, presumably to allow people to dismiss what might happen to them. So again, going back to Nazi Germany, much as the way that certain segments of humanity were dehumanized, were called names and treated as subhuman, and so that when their eventual move to concentration camps and eventual extermination or whatever started to happen, people were kind of indifferent to it because they'd been led to believe that these people were not deserving of the rights of so-called normal people. And the Ministry of Enlightenment have been laying the seeds with the Gore and the planet Gorman, and presumably other races as well. So basically to remove any potential, or to lessen the potential for disgust at any actions that might happen. I can only guess as to how this is going to end up, because we're coming up to the Gorman massacre, everybody. Now, there's discussions amongst the functionaries, hey, could we not say there's a plague? Could we not say that? And apparently they've gamed out all these options, and they're too, what's the word? They're not reliable enough. Krennic has a sneaky chat with Dedra, who's been very quiet, and he's like, come on, you've already worked out a plan, haven't you? Because he knows about her, he's heard about her. And she says, and she implies something very interesting, that almost as if she suggests that they need rebel insurgents to provoke an appropriate response. So it's interesting, the very existence of the rebellion itself is being used, or has the potential to be used by the Empire as a false flag operation to justify clampdowns. And that's a very Dedra Meero way of thinking, because this is the way her mind operates, as we saw in Series 1. And it's a very cynical way of the Empire operating. It's kind of like, again, going back to World War II, to justify the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, certain cross-border incursions were faked by Nazi Germany, and saying, oh, the Poles, they're attacking us. And essentially the invasion of Poland was spun as we're just defending ourselves. We're just going into Poland because of, we've had these attacks. There's a very similar situation in the world at the moment with Ukraine, with Vladimir Putin, ironically, mounting a denazification program in Ukraine, because he claims that Russia's being attacked by Ukraine when clearly Russia's the aggressor. And I'm not getting into a debate about this. If you don't think that's the case, then stop watching my videos, right? Because that's clearly what's happening. But this is kind of like, this is so on the nose, this episode. Dedra Meero suggests that they provoke, or they have the right rebels doing something that will allow the Empire to respond accordingly. So presumably they are going to provoke some kind of atrocity, supposedly on behalf of the rebels, so that the Empire can then legitimately crack down and say, well, we've got to do this because, you know, innocent people are dying, or to protect our interests, or they've murdered a bunch of Imperials. We're having to crack down. And yeah, it's unfortunate that a load of Gorman people are dying, but, you know, we've been forced into this. It's an interesting way of the Empire kind of using its enemies as a convenient kind of scapegoat. Anyway, the episode ends quite abruptly. It ends with Andor. The gang that have captured Andor have a slight disagreement and start shooting at each other. And then we are in the credits. I haven't watched any more episodes yet. I'm literally going to be doing these reviews one episode at a time. I will watch another episode tomorrow, and I'll do another review episode tomorrow. I don't know how other people are doing these reviews. I don't know whether they're reviewing them as a block. I don't know. I haven't watched anything else. I've literally just finished watching the episode. These are my thoughts. Andor, Series 1 was brilliant. This one is proving to be just as good, with some very interesting, you know, things to think about. It's not without humour, but it's quite dark, because essentially this is Star Wars as seen on the ground by the everyday man, right? I have no problem with stories about Jedi and Sith and the Emperor and Darth Vader and all this kind of stuff. That's fine, but I've always been more kind of interested in Star Wars from the perspective of the everyman. And Andor is kind of that everyman. He's been dragged into this through, against his will almost, because of the way he's been treated by the Empire, kind of sucked into this vortex of intrigue, if you like. And we can kind of see what Imperial rule means like for people on the ground. This is, and I don't mean this in a bad way, and I said this for Series 1, this is gutter level Star Wars, right? This is a world away from like Revenge of the Sith, Empire Strikes Back. This is gutter level Star Wars. And I have to say it's brilliant for it. And this is exactly the sort of thing that I'm here for. It's Star Wars treated as a war, right? Albeit a guerrilla war at this stage. But yeah, so I'm really hoping that this series lives up to the promise of the first one. This is the last series. They've only done 2. And I think, you know, I think it's probably good to get out while the going's good. So let's hope the rest of the series lives up to it. I'm very pleased to see things like the TIE Avenger and Gorman kind of brought into it. I'm very pleased to see the machinations of Director Krennic and Dedra Meero, and also Cassian Andor, again, a victim of circumstance in his current situation. And I'm very interested to see how this is going. So that's me. I've been rattling on for 33 minutes and 30 seconds-ish. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Total Ramblings. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please join me for the next episode of Total Ramblings. So I'm going to be looking at the next episode of Andor. Obviously, we've got a new episode of Doctor Who coming up on Saturday, and other things that I might decide to do. In the meantime, please do all the usual YouTube-y stuff. Hit like, subscribe, share, comment, blah-de-blah-de-blah. And I hope to see you very soon. Bye-bye.